Japan Studio is, and will forever be, my favorite development studio in the industry. And I use present tense instead of past tense because while the studio doesn't exist anymore, their legacy sure as hell does. Mark my words, I will talk about every game this studio made or die trying. And I don't mean games they helped with, I mean the games that are under the Japan Studio label that were solely made by the teams within the studio. And what better game to discuss first from them than Ico? To be honest though, I could have picked any of their games to start with. Ape Escape, Siren, Gravity Rush, or without a doubt, their most successful and most widely regarded, Shadow of the Colossus. So why Ico then? Part of it is because it's just what my brain wants to talk about in the here and now. The story behind Ico's development and the story and gameplay within Ico are extremely interesting and latched onto my brain like a tumor. Another part is because it's just not as accessible as Team Ico's other work, and if I can influence even just one person into buying and playing it today, I'll be happy. Ico is becoming more inaccessible by the day. The newest version of it you can play right now is the PS3 version, while Shadow of the Colossus has a remake for the PS4 that can also be played on PS5. The Last Guardian is also playable on PS4 and PS5. And while a copy of the game won't cost you that much, seriously, these prices are a steal, you even get it bundled with the original Shadow of the Colossus on top of it. A PS3 is going to run you some money, and as the years go on, they're only going to become more expensive while the retro market catches up. If you're interested in Ico by the end of this, or just have thought about getting a PS3, now is the time to buy because they're not going to get any cheaper. And the final part is because of Ico's influence. There was something I heard ages ago, God knows where, about how every modern 3D game, or at least shooter, has some roots in Quake, being one of the first 3D games, obviously, whether the developers of those modern games know it or not. It was so influential that it made people stop calling anything that came after Doom, Doom clones, and instead birthed the name of quite possibly the most well-known genre in all of video games, the FPS. I would argue that Ico is similar in that its DNA is in so many story-driven games, and it pioneered telling stories in games, and it also inspired various dev teams and big names with many of its ideas, like Kojima saying that Ico inspired some of Metal Gear Solid 3's visuals, or Phil Fish when making Fez using Ico's design by subtraction approach, or even Hidetaka Miyazaki, creator of the Dark Souls series, stating that Ico was a huge influence for him to get involved with game development. Ico pushed the envelope of what games could do with how they told their stories, and it's left an undeniable impact on so many developers and teams, AAA or otherwise, which might make you wonder how Ico was a hit with just about everybody who played it, and yet, financially, well, by 2009 the game had only sold 700,000 copies. Ico originally released in 2001. It's a wonder Team Ico managed to get another game after that. Maybe there was just enough goodwill with the executives, I don't know. Undoubtedly, Ico is a cult classic, and unfortunately, that term is only used for things that aren't too successful. Thankfully, someone at Sony still saw potential with Japan Studio and Team Ico. That's notable too. I kinda said it earlier, but yeah, Japan Studio was made up of multiple teams, like Team Asobi, who are known for the Astrobot games and spun off into their own studio after Japan Studio went defunct. Or Project Siren, originally made up of ex-Team Silent developers, known for obviously the Siren series, but also one of my favorite game series, Gravity Rush. And then there's Team Ico, of course, known for Ico, obviously, Shadow of the Colossus, and The Last Guardian. They would also become their own studio, with a name change that I'm not super fond of. Gen design is, well, from an artistic standpoint, it almost feels corporate, as if the change was made to seem more palatable as a business than as a group of artists. Not to mention, it kinda spits all over the history of this team, or now studio, I guess. Ico was incredibly important to the foundation of it, and I don't know, it just leaves a sort of bad taste in my mouth. But what's done is done, I suppose, and one little name change isn't the worst that could happen with the legacy of these games. It's honestly just a wonder that 2 out of 3 of them are still playable on modern consoles. Again, Ico really should get another re-release. Speaking of which, I played through the PS3 version of Ico for this video since it's the only version I own. I'm also using an AV to HDMI cable I got off of Limited Run Games' website instead of using an HDMI splitter because of 2 reasons. The first reason is that I'm cheap and don't care enough to get one. The other, more important reason, is that I actually prefer how it looks. I've always loved this lo-fi look for older games, and I think it works very cleanly for Ico and Shadow of the Colossus. I bring this up because it does cause an already existing problem with Ico to become worse. The game is just too goddamn dark at times, even in full HD. Of course, because of how AV cables work though, dark spots become a whole lot darker. So if you see me struggling in any of this footage in darker areas, just keep in mind part of it is an actual problem with the game, but another part of it is my own dumbass stubbornness to finally join the rest of you in the 21st century. I'm also getting a little ahead of myself, so we're gonna reel it back, and I mean way back. All the way back to the PS1. A lot of you may have heard of Ico before, but I wonder how many of you are aware that it started its life as a PS1 game. It didn't last as a PS1 game, of course, but it definitely would have been the most impressive game on the console had it been released on it, period. It had real-time lighting among other things, and its ambition was clearly brimming. Hell, even the FMV cutscenes were staggeringly better than their competition at the time, and it says a lot, I think, that even when it moved to PS2, Ico stayed a technical marvel. A lot of PS2 games were afraid to go as hard as Ico did with its visuals, possibly in fear of the games not running well on the hardware, or maybe because they might just age poorly. And Ico does this really fascinating thing that games, especially linear games, so rarely do. All of the castle fits within itself. Every single room in the place is to scale with the outside walls. It's just nuts. It's that crazy attention to detail that is just one of the many signs of how much effort was put into making this game as good as it could possibly be. And usually you only saw this kind of quality with the big PS2 games, the games that came from already popular series or developers. But Ico came from a brand new team in a studio that prior was most famous for a silly monkey-catching platformer. And even then, Ape Escape was always way more popular in Japan. And no, I don't count Parappa or Jammalami or Vibramon because Japan Studio only assisted with those games' development. That same thing happened with Japan Studio and Bloodborne, by the way. Not relevant, I just thought it was interesting. To say releasing a game like Ico in the US, let alone it having this much polish, was a risk is... well, it's not exactly an understatement, I suppose. It wasn't the biggest risk ever. This was PS1 to PS2 era Sony we're talking about. They were on top of the world at this point. They could afford to take the hit. Hell, that's probably part of the reason Ico was allowed to exist the way that it is in the first place, and possibly the reason they got Shadow of the Colossus afterwards. But I guess to explain what I mean, for just about any other studio, even AAA, Ico would have been a really big risk with how much work and dev time was put into it. Ico technically started development in 1997 and was later released at the tail end of 2001. That's just about 4 years of dev time, which for today is nothing. But for those of you that are too young to remember, or too young to even know of this, that was a lot of time for game development back then. For reference, Valve was founded in August of 1996, and Half-Life started development quite soon after. In 1997, it was practically finished, before they decided to scrap almost the entire game and start over. Half-Life was then released in 1998. For that timeline to make sense, Half-Life's total development time would have had to have been just about 2 years. Ico was made in nearly double that amount of time, and as a game was far more technically impressive and hardware pushing. Both are still amazing games though, of course, don't get it twisted. Half-Life's legacy is just as important as Ico's legacy, hell, both even for one of the same reasons. And I suppose on that note, now would be as good a time as any to discuss Ico's story. On the surface, it's really simple, arguably even bare bones. The story of a young boy trapped in a castle to later discover a much taller than himself girl in very much the same situation. Together, they must cooperate to escape not only the castle, but the queen who wants the girl, her daughter, to stay so that she may use her body as a vessel, since her own is old and weakening. It's a story that's very straightforward, it's almost fable-like. What's different here though, what makes Ico's story stand out, is that it tells its story simply, but is clearly more complex when you really start to examine it, and it tells it almost entirely through its gameplay as well. There's very few traditional cutscenes in Ico, and for the ones that are there, they're necessary, they push the plot forward naturally without being expository or bloated. These are things that would become running trends with Team Ico's games. Ico also uses entirely fixed camera angles to help the feeling of each area and each moment be better realized, to make them have the most impact they could possibly have. Cinematography, like all art forms, is a language after all, and Ico says a lot. This does unfortunately lead to two downsides that a lot of games with both analog control and fixed camera angles have, which are depth perception and transitionary states. In, say, the original Silent Hill trilogy, neither of these are an issue because of the lack of platforming and the addition of tank controls. When both of those things are reversed, though, it can lead to cheap-feeling pitfalls and janky movement when running between different angles. But even then, I would still rather Ico have the camera system it has now than a traditional third-person or 3D platformer-type camera for what it adds to the storytelling and the artistry. I love when the game uses wide shots like this. It makes our titular character Ico and his companion Yorda feel small and powerless. And they kind of both are small and powerless, especially in comparison to the size of the castle, and in spite of that, they still persevere in the hope that they'll both escape together. Of course, cool camera angles aren't all Ico's visuals and storytelling have going for it. Just about everything you see in the game has something to say. The graves littered around, the castle itself, and even the enemies you fight. Especially the enemies you fight. Okay, hold on, there's something important that I need to bring up here before we get to that. So, why is Ico in this giant castle anyway, you might be asking? For the Queen and Yorda, it's their home, although I'd hardly call it a home for Yorda. But Ico doesn't live here. He was brought here by some members of his own village, as a sacrifice. In his village, boys like Ico are born with horns due to an ancient curse, and those boys are seen as the cause of the village's problems. So, in a bet to solve those problems, when they become 12 years old, the boys with horns are then taken to the castle and put into large coffins to starve or freeze to death. Luckily for Ico, this castle is old and has many moving parts. So, with a bit of rumbling, Ico's coffin is jostled free and breaks apart. He's knocked unconscious and has a vision of a cage hanging in a very tall room. From here, Ico sets Yorda free and sets a path for the both of them to escape. It should also be noted that Yorda doesn't do much outside of the story. When it comes to gameplay, she herself is only ever used for opening doors, but Yorda is also still a huge element of the gameplay. I'm sure that sounded kind of contradictory, but there's not really a better way to describe this next thing. To put it in simple terms, Ico is kind of a long escort mission. To a lot of you that have never played this game before, that probably sounds kind of, shit? But please, trust me, it's a good escort mission, a really good escort mission. And while Yorda herself can't do much, the monsters that want to kidnap her can do a lot. If you're not careful and leave Yorda alone, fuck, Yoda.
Niko, save me, you must.
If you're not careful and you leave Yorda alone for too long in a room you're not in, the monsters, or shadows as they're actually called, will grab her while you're busy, and if you don't get to her in time, it's a game over. So obviously, stay with Yorda as much as possible, right? Bring her into every new room with you. Easy. Not exactly. Oftentimes you'll need Yorda to go places you can go, but she can't. At least, not immediately. That usually means you'll have to leave her behind until you can figure out how to get her to where you are. It's a nice additional stressor that forces you to think quick on your feet, or else result in you scrambling to save her, or worse, going back to your most recent save. Ico uses manual save points, by the way. And they can call it a bench all they want, but that's a fucking sofa. Of course, because of this element of the gameplay, it means the puzzles can't be too brain-taxing, lest they become very frustrating very quickly. That's not to say you won't get stuck, though. There are parts even on this return playthrough that I had kind of forgotten the solutions to myself. I even ran into quite a couple of moments of frustration, most specifically near the end of Ico. By that point, some of the puzzles can go on for a little long and span multiple rooms, and messing up can mean losing a lot of progress. I started saving all the time because of this whenever I could. Funnily enough, I only game over to enemies a total of one time this entire playthrough if I'm remembering right. Most of my deaths were due to poor jumps often caused by that aforementioned lack of depth perception at points. I don't know about hard mode, but on the normal difficulty, enemies are usually total pushovers, albeit being slogs to get through sometimes. Especially in the penultimate battle, where you have to fight over 50 of these shadows. It's not even difficult, it just goes on for a while and is a little tiring. It's a bit of a shame too, because narratively, this fight is really impactful, and also depressing, for lack of a better word. Near the end of Ico, you end up back in the very room you started in, and up the stairs past the coffins you find Yorda, now a statue. Realizing there's nothing you can do for her, you head back to the coffins and are bombarded with shadows. Shadows that are more childlike in design than the ones you fought before. Shadows that have distinctive horns, not unlike the very ones atop Ico's head. And as you defeat each of these shadows, the various coffins indented in the walls begin to light up one by one. I don't think I need to explain to you what's going on here. You seem fairly smart to me, I'm sure you get it. This is one of my favorite reveals in the game, and the first time I realized it, it made my head start spinning with ideas and theories. Are all of the shadows I've fought so far just more dead children? Or well, there are a lot of graves in the castle, maybe the bigger shadows are prior residents that passed away in different ways? Maybe the other shadows aren't even human. Many of them have Oni as a prefix to their names. Maybe they're demons? And not so much a question, more so a huge light bulb going off. Ico would have become one of these things, had he not gotten extremely lucky. It kinda hits you like a truck when you get to this part if you're paying attention. Stuff like this is why it's so easy to call Ico a beautiful experience. And I haven't even gotten into Ico's art direction for the most part, which is to this day, outside of Team Ico's other games, a visual style I've never seen anything similar to. And the way it uses bloom, of all things, is genuinely really well executed. Besides, again, Team Ico's other games, I've only ever seen bloom used effectively in any other game once, that game being Twilight Princess. And while Ico's gameplay isn't the most in-depth or interesting thing to play or to discuss, I don't know if I even think that it matters. Sure, there were moments of frustration and even boredom while playing, but none of that stuff sticks with me very much after every time I finished this game. The way I see it, Ico's gameplay is more a means to an end rather than trying to be traditional video game gameplay. It serves a more important purpose in helping flesh out the story, the world, and the characters. I brought it up earlier, but Ico uses the design by subtraction approach, coined by the game's director Fumito Ueda, which is probably the leading reason why so much of the game's gameplay is so simple. Basically, if something doesn't need to be there, if it doesn't really add anything, then why keep it? It's why the game has no stamina or health meter, hell it has no HUD at all, and it's also why there's so few ways to actually fail. These things either don't give any useful information to the player or just don't need to be there, period. It's a design philosophy that really clicked with development teams of all sorts, and we can see it in so many games of today. Games like Inside or Journey, for instance. This approach can even be seen in Ico's soundtrack. There are very few traditional tracks in Ico, it's nearly all ambience for most of the game. When music does play, it's used for things like enemy encounters, which are generally more tense than the rest of what you've been doing up to those parts. A notable track is Heal, which plays when you're saving. It's this light, fluffy sounding track that's extremely relaxing. It's part of why I love the saving in this game, on top of being a useful couple of moments to let the player digest what they've seen and done up to that point, which for a game like Ico, brimming with things to say, is a very important couple of moments. And then there's You Were There. This song is compelling for a lot of different reasons, one of the big ones being it's the only track in the whole game with lyrics, but it's more so what's said in those lyrics, specifically 2 lines. Sing Nonomori, Endless Corridors. Say Nonomori, Hopeless Warriors. Some context, near the end of the game, Ico and Yorda actually do make it out of the castle onto this long bridge, but it starts to recede with Ico on one side and Yorda on the other. Ico then makes a leap of faith, caught by Yorda. This is a big role reversal, as Ico had been doing the same for Yorda for every big jump previous. Sadly, the queen slowly turns Yorda to stone while she's still holding on to Ico. Weakened, and with the inevitable soon approaching, Yorda says one last thing to Ico before both of their presumed deaths. Nonomori. Thank you. Which brings us back to those 2 lines. The Endless Corridors line is most likely referring to the castle itself. The Hopeless Warriors one, though, could be interpreted a couple of different ways, I think. Maybe it represents Ico and Yorda, a hopeless struggle for 2 kids to escape a place so much bigger than the both of them. Or maybe it's calling back to the people from Ico's village that brought him there, in a hopeless decision to bring their children to an untimely death on the off chance it removes their possibly not even existing curse. It could also refer to the shadows, the likely soulless husks of the deceased who fight tooth and nail to capture Yorda for their malevolent queen. And starting each line with Nonomori could mean that the song is being sung by Yorda, or it could just be from her perspective. Or maybe I'm just reading too much into these things. It's entirely possible, especially with art like Ico that's left so up to the viewer to decipher. I don't claim to be a smart man, average is probably more applicable, I just like to talk about things I enjoy. There's more to that song, too, a lot more that could probably be its own video entirely. I'm not too interested in that prospect though, so if someone else who's a fan of Ico thinks that sounds fun and wants to make that video themselves, the idea is all yours. With that said, let's get into Ico's ending. I'll start off from after the bridge scene I just brought up a moment ago. After Yorda is turned to stone and lets go of Ico, he wakes up on some hanging cages, and from then on, it's back to the usual puzzle platforming the rest of the game is known for, with a notable difference. Yorda's absence is felt in more ways than one. Tonally and visually, the game has gotten darker, likely to sell that rock-bottom feeling that most players and Ico himself would be dealing with. There are also no more save points, and even if there were, you can't use them without Yorda being with Ico. And of course, the most obvious change is that Yorda is absent. There's no more guiding her from room to room, and there's no more protecting her from shadows because, to put it bluntly, you failed. But even then, you push forward, through perilous jumps and long-lasting battles, until finally you confront the Queen. Using her own sword against her, and with the very possible outcome of Ico himself being turned to stone, he fights and withers down her defense, until finally with one last plunge, it's over. This final hit is very, very satisfying after everything you've gone through, which says a lot because in terms of gameplay, this fight is genuinely just kind of bad. It's not difficult or frustrating, but it does drag on and barely anything changes the whole fight. The most that happens is that the Queen's single attack speeds up a little bit. That's it, really. There's no big puzzle or platforming elements, 2 things that basically define the best the game has to offer. Instead, you're just fighting a slightly different shadow pretty much. And yet, despite all of that, like I said, that final hit is undeniably satisfying. Narratively, it's a symbol of Ico and maybe any future Horn children finally being free from their disturbing fate. And it's a symbol of Yorda's true freedom too. After her mother is defeated and Ico is knocked out by one last attack by the Queen and the castle starts to crumble without its ruler, Yorda is brought back from being a statue. And in a very touching and powerful final moment, as a parallel to what Ico had been trying to do for Yorda the whole game up to this point, she uses this newfound strength to save Ico before the castle collapses in on itself. Then, just like that, the credits roll. To call Ico anything other than gorgeous would be a disservice. It takes its, on the surface, simple premise and does so much with so little. It's not perfect. I've made it clear multiple times now that Ico's gameplay, specifically its combat, does hold it back. Not enough to keep it from still being an amazing experience, definitely well worth your time, but still enough to keep it from reaching the heights of its successor, that's for certain. and we'll get to that game someday, trust me. And yet, despite future games by both Team Ico and just Japan Studio in general being undeniably more loved, more well-known, and in my opinion better, Ico still holds one thing over all of them: its mastery of simplicity.